What do Chinese companies actually want when they're overseas and possibly in your country?
It was a Chinese company that was directly linked to the Chinese Communist Party that was given the contract, should never have been given the contract. I said that at the time.
Often Chinese companies are regarded as having nefarious political motivations. There's an implication here that because they're from a communist regime, they can't possibly be interested in simple capitalist pursuits like profit making. So they must be over here trying to further the political motives of the Chinese state, and those can only be bad. This is a narrative we often hear from hawkish types on the political right. Here's an account from the YouTube channel of the Sun newspaper in the UK.
China has always been known for what we call economic infiltration. And this is by acquiring certain assets where they could, if they so chose, to influence and disrupt or even potentially sabotage those business operations by the control and powers that they have.
But there's another narrative too, this time on the left, which also sees China's role overseas, especially in the global south, as politically motivated, but this time in a positive sense. In this view, China is not a scary communist regime, but a socialist country.
The system is still socialist.
So its government is concerned with fairness and wanting to promote a better deal for global south countries in particular.
What Beijing wants is a more peaceful world in which the countries of the global south can come together and economically develop and lift their people out of poverty.
In this video, I'll be suggesting that both these positions are wrong. First of all, China is a capitalist country, and its companies, including its state-owned companies, are concerned with profit making. If we ignore this, then we can't really understand how Chinese companies work. But second, some companies also have political remits in addition to their profit-making goals. This means they sometimes behave differently from how we would expect companies to behave if they're just focused on profit. In this video, I'll give you a way to interpret what Chinese companies overseas are up to and how they navigate the different goals with both political and commercial aims in mind. To do this, I'll be drawing on the work of the sociologist Ching especially her very important book, The Specter of Global China. What Li shows us very clearly is that you can't just make claims about what a Chinese company is trying to achieve just based on the fact that it's Chinese. I'm simplifying Li's work here for the purposes of this video, but based on her analysis, I've come up with 5 criteria that it's necessary to look at. 1. Is the company private or state-owned? 2. What sector or industry is it in? 3. What country is it operating in? In other words, what is the host country? 4. What time period are we looking at? And 5, what are the political and economic conditions in that country at that time? How Chinese companies behave overseas will depend on all 5 of these things. What I'll do now is talk you through one case study which Li talks about in her book so you can see how this works. This is a Chinese state-owned company. It's called Non-Ferrous Metal China Africa, NFCA. It's working in the copper mining industry and the host country is Zambia. The time period is 2007 to 2014. By the way, I should mention that this company has unfortunately been in the news recently because of a very serious flooding disaster which has caused a huge amount of controversy, but that event is not relevant to Li's case study because she's talking about a time period several years before this happened. The time period that Li is talking about was characterized by the following 3 political and economic conditions. First, there was a strong sense of resource nationalism among the population at this time. That is, people in the country were fed up of feeling like the country's national resources have been used to benefit foreign investors. They want a fairer share of these resources for themselves. There's also quite a lot of worker activism, like strikes against foreign companies. Second, on this nationalist wave, a populist government has come to power which is going to be more likely to stand up to foreign investors. Third, this time period includes 2008, which is when the global financial crisis hit. Now that we have these crucial pieces of information, we can work out, first of all, what are the goals of this company? And second, What are the difficulties this company will have to navigate? In other words, they can't just do whatever they like. There are 3 goals that Li identifies. First, NFCA is a corporation, so it's going to be interested in making a profit. We can take that one for granted. Second, it's a state-owned company and it's involved in copper mining. Copper is an important strategic resource for the Chinese state. So it has a major political task as well, and that is to maintain a stable supply of copper ore over the long term for China's development needs. And finally, and as much as this is a company which is acting as a representative of the Chinese state, it has a further goal of trying to build good diplomatic relations with the elites in Zambia. Li studied how the NFCA behaved in comparison to private companies from countries other than China, which were also working in Zambia in the same sector. She found that the NFCA did indeed behave differently from these other companies. The major difference was that because NFCA needed to maintain long-term stability of the supply of copper ore to China, it did not make decisions based only on the consideration of short-term profits for shareholders. Here's Li explaining this. The sound isn't so great, I'm afraid, so I've given you subtitles.
Sorry. For the Chinese, copper is important because they can sell for money, but also the ore itself, the use value of copper is important to Chinese state. And that's why even when copper prices may go down a lot, the Chinese mine will stay because their objective is not only to make profit, they want the ore.
When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, all the private companies from other countries pulled straight out of the mining sector because the price of copper crashed, so they sacked all their workers. And this was a disaster for many Zambian families. But NFCA stuck around because their 2 political roles, guaranteeing stability of the copper supply for China and building up good diplomatic relations with the Zambian elite, were more important at that time than pursuing profit. Here's Li explaining what happened.
In the financial crisis, when the crisis hit, these global companies immediately reacted by retrenching labor, laying off a total of 1/3 of the mining workforce, and it was an earthquake for a country that was totally dependent on copper. Miners earn the highest salaries among the working class in Zambia because it's the most lucrative sector. And usually one miner has to support not just his or her own, usually his biological dependence, but also just a whole bunch of dependents because people die young. Average age life expectation is only 47 years old, so you have to take care of the kids of your brothers and cousins, and so it was a big crisis for many Zambians because these companies began retrenching. Guess what the Chinese did? Remember, its goal is to accumulate political capital, to buy the goodwill of the Zambian elite, to influence, therefore, hopefully, the diplomacy. And also, it wants to establish itself, the legitimacy of the mine in Zambia, to influence society, and also it wants copper. It doesn't want to stop production of copper. So the Chinese, during that same period, it was very stark difference, came out and say, we have a 3 no's policy. No retrenchment, no reduction in salary, no reduction in production. It was very stable. And the reason was because it has goals more than financial goals.
Now, not only did the NFCA stick around when others left after 2008, but in the years afterwards, their relationship to their workers was different from the other companies as well. Remember, this was a time of strong resource nationalism in Zambia under a populist government. This means that during that time, there was a lot of worker activism against foreign companies, including strikes. A lot of these strikes didn't get very far with the private companies from other countries because they were only thinking short term and trying to keep costs down as much as possible. This means that their workers were hired on short term, casual contracts. And these companies were outsourcing their hiring of workers to subcontracting companies, largely because this looks good to the shareholders because it's cheaper. This meant that it was very difficult for workers to organise strikes across all of the subcontractors at once. Basically, all the workers were working for different people. And also because their labour contracts were short-term and not very secure, as soon as any of them went on strike, they could easily be fired. But for the NFCA, it wasn't like that.
You only have one subcontractor. Your workers are unified because you're dealing with one employer. If you have many subcontractors, your workforce is totally divided. In the Chinese state mine case, you see stronger labor power that has to do with how they run the mine, and how they run the mine has to do with their interest. And so it is connected that labor is more powerful in the Chinese state mine, again, against our expectation that state capital is more powerful, exploitative, and everything else that you have heard about Chinese capital. Whereas in the global private mines, actually, workers' strike are shorter, less powerful, and as a result, companies made less concession, and they were fired more because they're responding. Companies are responding to fluctuation in copper prices, and when your company is listed in the London Stock Exchange, you have professionally, your first reaction to anything is to cut labor.
There's an important question to ask here though. Is the NFCA treating its workers better because China is a socialist country which reflects worker-friendly values and is a natural ally of the Global South? Lee says no, definitely not. Here are two ways to show that this assumption is wrong. First of all, the workers were only able to get those more secure contracts because they engaged in worker activism and bargained hard for them, and they had greater political leverage. Because A, the NFCA wanted to stay on good diplomatic terms with the Zambian government, which at this point was a populist government supportive of its workers, and B, they needed the stable copper supply, and that relied on a stable workforce which didn't keep going on strike. If not for the strikes and other forms of activism, the workers would not have had such a good deal, and in any case, they still did not get everything they pushed for. Their wages remained very low. Remember, this is still a capitalist corporation which wants to make as much profit as it can alongside the other political goals that it has. In fact, Lee found that the wages it paid to its workers were so low that they were even lower than the wages at the private companies that Lee was comparing them to, even though the workers there were on less stable contracts. Overall, Lee says that the deal for the NFCA workers was not necessarily better than for the workers at the other companies. It was just a different kind of labour regime. More job security for less pay versus less job security but more pay. Here's what Lee said in her book. The Chinese NFCA was the only mine where even its contractors' workers received permanent terms of employment, but many workers reminded me that this seeming security came at the high price of low wages. Pastor Peary, sorry I don't know how to pronounce that, who had been with the NFCA since 2003, remarked that it's small money, but there is no pruning, no redundancy. The only people who are fired are those who drink. They pay us on time. But with 7 children, 4 of whom are still attending high school, his K2.5 million salary just is not enough. He goes to the loan sharks to borrow money. Second, remember that one of the key criteria we looked at the start was what sector or industry is this company in. Lee found that when she looked at another sector, construction, Chinese state companies behaved in exactly the same way that non-Chinese private companies behaved. Because in construction, the political and strategic goals which applied to copper mining, and which meant that NFCA had to bargain with the Zambian workers, did not apply. So Chinese companies in the construction sector behaved about the same when it came to insecure contracts, low wages, and abusive management. Just basic standard capitalism at work. Lee put it like this. It must be emphasized that Chinese state capital did not present an alternative to systemic capitalist subordination and exploitation of labour. It only offered a different bargain in the strategic mining sector. In the non-strategic and highly informalised construction sector, marked by weak labour capacity and lack of Zambian government support for its own workers, Chinese state capital was as exploitative of labour as the rest. Now, you may be wondering, why would a Chinese state-owned company need to be profit-making in the first place, when surely it's financially backed by the state? If you're wondering this, I have another video which explains how this works. It should be showing on your screen now. If it isn't, I've posted a link in the description below this video. Thank you for watching.